Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy, your favorite daily public policy podcast from the Takshashila Institution. I'm Anushka Saxena, a staff research analyst with the institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program. And today I'm joined by my colleague Amit Kumar for a conversation on China's local government finances. As we know, there is a lot of budding interest in understanding the causes behind the economic slowdown and the evolving economic policy priorities within the second largest economy in the world, which is China. And of course, a lot of the context for this is provided by the ensuing trade and tariff war between the two biggest economies of the world, which is China and the US. And with increasing external hostility vis-a-vis a lot of the global economy's dependence on China, its market distorting practices, and the overcapacity problem that its saturated manufacturing base has created, when you kind of complement this and combine this with the sustained slowdown or degrowth, so to say, in the Chinese economy, you get a vague sense of the exact problems facing China today. And these have obvious repercussions for all the economies that China, for example, is the largest trading partner for. It has consequences for China's contribution to global GDP growth, which, by the way, it has been a major contributor for in the past decades or so to say. And obviously, it has some degree of a fallout for India, which must then think about its own diversification-related solutions. But that's a conversation for a different day. Today, I thought to keep the conversation in this episode narrow, focused, and still interesting, we could discuss one specific aspect of China's economic model and strategy, which is local government financing. Now, in China's context, as I understand it, local government is the kind of umbrella term that includes not just provincial governments, but also the four levels of local government as a whole, which is small counties, villages and townships, so on and so forth. And Amit obviously has been looking at Chinese economic developments and the slowdown within the country for the past year sustainably. In his previous research work for Takshashila, he has identified the couple major kind of challenges China is facing today, which include a slowdown in investment, a consumption problem, a reduction in export markets globally. And of course, one of those is the troubles facing local government financing, which, by the way, has a lot of the burden to share when it comes to powering China's development and economic growth. So, Amit, without further ado, let me come to you with my first question. And just to grab the attention of our listeners, can you start by telling us one thing that you find interesting, or one fact or stat that you find interesting about China's local governments or local government financing that perhaps inspires you and should inspire other followers of geoeconomics today to look at this model and this ecosystem? Over to you, Amit.
Thank you so much, Anushka, for this wonderful opportunity to talk about China's local government. To your question, that one important or one key interesting fact about China's local governments, although I should admit that there are various facts that astound me and amaze me about China's local finance and the local government. But one thing, if I have to bring to your attention, would be the sheer scale of China's local government's expenditure. Now, you would remember that about a month ago, when the two sessions were held, Chinese Premier Li Chang claimed first that the country had successfully reached the 5% growth target set for 2024. And this year, for the year 2025, he has placed a target of 5%. Now, the interesting thing is that much of China's economic future and the success of the success or the fact that China would attain this target hinges on the performances of local governments. As rightly said, this includes the provincial government and all the sub-provincial governments, right? Now, unlike virtually any other country in the world, where if you see the proportion of expenditure that the local governments, which includes provincial and sub-provincial governments, uh, even Brazil, touted as the most fiscally federal country in the world, you would find that the local governments account for only 40% of the national budgetary expenditure. And this would astound you when I tell you that in case of China, local governments are responsible for about 85% of the national budgetary expenditure. Now, that is something which is very significant for me. Uh, Given how we analyze China and how we view China as a completely unitary state, the level of decentralization when it comes to execution or expenditure is massive. It's just uh, breathtaking in China. So, that would be my one interesting fact for our listeners that should get them interested in watching China's local finances.
That is interesting, indeed, Amit, especially because if the nature of budgetary expenditure is so huge, it also means a lot of the blame or the responsibility for seeing China through this tumultuous economic period would fall on the shoulders of provincial and other sub-provincial governments, especially considering the way the Chinese system has often worked across policy domains is that the central party state will be responsible for issuing mandates and its ideas about priorities, and local leaders and other CPC cadres would be responsible for implementing and executing them. So, if naturally the scale of the expenditure is so huge, and if the persons responsible fall below the central government level, it indeed becomes important to see how local governments act and how they manage their finances. But if I can kind of come to the idea of budgetary expenditure, right? How does the local government financing model in China differ from, say, other parts of the world? What do you mean when you say budgetary expenditure? Because, it's very rare that you see individual budgets for some of these uh, uh, provincial and sub-provincial governments coming out and being in the limelight. So, what's the model there, and how do they generate and spend revenue?
See, again, when it comes to China, China is again an outlier when it comes to how the budgets are maintained. So, across all levels of the government, you would find, unlike in any other country, uh, primarily the central government and the local governments maintain four different types of budgets. The first budget is the one that I just discussed. That is the general budget, the general local government budget in case of the local governments. This primarily entails revenues that you get from tax and some of the non-tax revenues. Now, this is the first and the primary budget. The second kind of budget that all levels of the governments maintain is called government managed fund budget. And now this is, I think, the second most important of the four budgets. And this fund primarily earns almost about 91% of its revenue from just two sources. The first would be the sale of land use rights, and the second would be special purpose bonds. So this is your second most important budget for the local governments. And the expenditures would range from compensation for land procurement, land preparation, interest payments, and most importantly, infrastructure development. So most of the infrastructure development that the local governments undertake are financed through this second primary budget uh, of the government. The third would be the social insurance fund budget, and this would entail your five primary insurances that you have in China: employment, residential, health, maternity, etc. Right, and this is the third, third largest fund of there, and this is largely an independent budget. All the expenses and revenues are solely dedicated for the purpose of insurance. There are no out budget transfers. The last budget, or the fourth budget, that I would like to mention here is that China, all levels of China's governments maintain is state capital operations budget. And this includes revenues from profits of state-owned enterprises. Now, mind you, both central government and local governments have their uh, state-owned enterprises that they own. Now, the revenues would include profits from those state-owned enterprises, dividends, liquidation, property transfer, and some central transfer. Now, the state-owned capital for both state capital operations budget and government managed fund budget. So when you look at you bifurcate it in central budget and the local budgets. Local budgets encompasses all of the levels of government. Now, if you look at it, most of the more than 90% of the national budgetary is dedicated to the local budgets. So mostly, even though the central governments maintain the managed fund budget and state-owned capital operations budget, much of the revenue and expenditure is incurred by the local governments. The central share in this national pool is quite less. So, and if you now aggregate and just add up the numbers of these four budgets, the share of local government expenditure that I just talked about at the beginning of the episode, that rises to about 90% of the national budgetary expenditure. Not general. When it comes to general budgetary expenditure, local governments share would be about 85%. But if you add up all these four separate budgets that the local governments maintain, the local government's expenditure shoots up to 90% of the national budget expenditure.
Right. And you talked about some out budget transfers that do not take place for the social insurance fund. Do they take place for others?
Yes. So there are some small transfers that are made from each of the budgets. So central government transfers some of the funds from their central budgets vertically to their respective or corresponding local budgets. And then there's transfers. There are both horizontal transfers and vertical transfers, but the scale of those transfers are too small. And yeah.
Right. So it seems from what you've told us here that if local governments are responsible for financing, say, 90% of the economy, they are also then, or 90% of the budgetary expenditures, so to say, they also receive the adequate support in that regard from the central government. And they have these diversified fund budget management systems that cater to perhaps all possible expenditures that they can be responsible for. So then, why is it that the Chinese economy is still facing such challenges? You know, you talked about land use rights, special purpose bonds. It seems all of those are factors that are taking a hit when it comes to the Chinese economy. So, why is it that we should be concerned about local government financing? And if you think about local government's revenue, right? If they earn it, say for example, sale of land use rights,
Right.
there would have then been obvious implications or fallouts from the real estate bubble or the crisis that we've been talking about in the past couple years. Savings being tied up, homeowners not receiving their deliverables on time, real estate firms undergoing a breaking point and subsequently debt. All of this, has it contributed to the dire state of local government financing? And if so, how?
Yes, of course, it has. Because, okay, first you have to, if you have to understand how the revenue model of China's local governments is being impacted, we need to go back to 1994. So before 1994, what happened was that the distribution of the taxes was such that it favored local governments. And central government had been observing that their share in the national revenue pool had drastically gone down, and they were kind of, and because of the expenditure mandate, even the central governments have expenditure mandates uh, to fulfill them. It was sort of becoming challenging for the central government. So what they did was in 1994 that they came up with tax sharing system, a tax reform in 1994. And what it essentially did was that it boosted central government's share of uh, revenue in the national pool to about 45%. And about 55% of the revenue pool was allotted to the local governments. Now, although the revenue distribution was somewhat equal between the two levels of the government, the expenditure mandate of the local governments was still rising. And as I just mentioned, at this point of time, it is somewhere around 85% of the national budgetary expenditure, general budgetary expenditure. So there was a mismatch, a complete mismatch in what uh, the mandates of the local governments were and the revenues that they were being given. Now, of course, the central government transfers up to 91% of the total revenue that they raise to the local governments. Again, unseen in any other part of the world. In China, it actually happens where the central government, after raising the revenue, they transfer about 91% of the total revenue that they raise to the local governments. But the interesting thing is that all these funds that are being transferred, the transfer that happens, are tied. So the local governments do not have the independence or the autonomy over the expenditure. It's just that the mandate belongs to the central government, and the local government just carry out the execution of those wherever the expenditure are supposed to happen. Now, the budget, as I said, general budgetary were the primary source of revenue for them. The second source of revenue for them was the general managed funds. Now, in the four budgets that we talked about, only three top budgets, that is the general budget, the government managed fund budget, and social insurance fund budget. They are to the tune of somewhat above 10 trillion Chinese yuan. The state-owned capital operations fund budget is quite small in comparison to these three budgets, less than half a trillion yuan. So that doesn't really help the local governments much. But and because as I mentioned earlier, that the social insurance fund budget is largely, the expenditure is largely restricted towards insurance expenditures, they don't really help the local governments when it comes to their expansion of expenditure in infrastructure and other avenues that might come up, right? So largely they have to rely on just two sources, that is the general budget and the government managed fund budget. Now, I already told you that the revenue share had gone down when it comes to general budget. And in the past few years, what we have seen is that the national revenue growth has also gone down. So this has constrained the revenue sources of both the central government and the local governments. Now, keep that aside and let's come to the second primary budget, that is the government funds budget. Now, here the two biggest sources are, as I had again earlier mentioned, was the land sales, the sale of land use rights, and the second was special debt revenue. Now, land sales if you see after the property bubble exploded, revenue from sale of land use rights dropped from an all-time high of about 8.7 trillion yuan in 2021 to about 5.8 trillion yuan in 2023. And last year it has dropped further below 5 trillion yuan. So it's almost a drop of 40% in the revenue of the local governments in just about 3 or 4 years. And this has severely constrained China's local government's finances, as land sales and, mind you, the some of the transfers that happens in general budget are tied. Here, the local government, the revenue that they raise, the local governments raise from general government managed fund budgets, are something which they have autonomy on, and they can spend towards new sort of expenditures and whatever infrastructure expenditure that might come up for them. So largely they rely on this. And as I also mentioned, the expenditure mandate is quite huge when it comes to the mandate of local governments, more than what is given to them in the general budget. So they mostly in the past they have relied on this government managed fund budget. And given now that the revenue from land sales have gone down, this has really constrained their finances. And that's how the problem has begun, that we keep hearing about the local finances are in dire strait.
Right. So, firstly, the statistic about a nearly 40% decline in revenue from land sales for the government managed fund budget is quite shocking, right? And you can see why this is a huge problem for local government financing because, and this is just a summary of the arguments you've made, but just for our listeners, you understand why this is a problem because the expenditure mandate of the local governments is huge
and expanding.
The general budget doesn't receive enough revenue by virtue of bureaucratic hurdles and other center state restrictions in the tax sharing model of the country. And the 1 out of 4 budgets that the local governments truly have autonomy on to fulfill their broad and expanding mandate is facing weakening revenue in lieu of property estate related issues and other things. So naturally, Amit, if the local governments are going to fulfill their mandates, and they must do so because, again, this is a fact of life in the Chinese party state system or the Marxist-Leninist system, that political promotions and patron-client networks are a result of not just overlapping tenures, but also excellent performance, demonstrated efficiency in implementing the central leadership's ideas. Naturally, all local governments are going to make an effort to demonstrate their capability to fulfill their mandate, even if they don't have enough revenue. And at one point, I think during the 2 sessions in the government work report, Li Chang also mentioned that this year China's target for fiscal deficit is around 4%.
Yeah.
Now, between this ambitious target and the need for local governments to sustain their political and economic legitimacy, there has to be something going on that perhaps the world isn't really aware of. There has to be some fudging of numbers, some other way the local governments are, or some other methods the local governments are deploying to both meet the fiscal deficit target and the broadening scope of their mandates. Can you shed some light on what's going on there?
Yeah, this is one interesting, again, puzzle for at least for me, when I started reading up on China's local finances. So if you would look at the work report from last year, you'd find that the fiscal deficit target was about 3%. And this year, because of this last 2 sessions in March, the Chinese premier has eased the fiscal deficit to about 4% of the GDP. Now, you must have come across a lot of articles or briefs by S&P and Moody and Fitch Ratings, etc., where they point out that actual fiscal deficit in China, that is both the central government and the local government combined, is somewhere around 6.5%. But if that is so, why is this not showing up on their budget, right? So when I was looking for it and investigating into this question, I found out that The answer to this question lies in China's accounting practices and its off-budget financing. So largely, I mean, when it comes to 6%, the 6% rate, it's largely to do with their accounting practices. Uh, Now, the accounting method China follows obscures some of the local government's fiscal deficit. For instance, between 2020 to 2023, local governments raised about 3.8 trillion yuan each year through special purpose bonds. Now, this constitutes, as you would remember, I had pointed out that this is one of the two sources of revenue for government managed fund budget. Now, this constitutes at second largest source of revenue for the local government fund budget, right? But this money raised through this route is technically a debt that is masquerading as revenue, which must be paid back with interest. Now, these are special purpose bonds. These are not revenue per se. They're counted as revenue in the local government's budget, but they're essentially debt that has to be paid off, right? So this interesting thing that they bring to the local government finance budget, this skews the numbers. And if you account for this, you would find that the local government's fiscal deficit alone rises to about 4.7%, well beyond the 3% target that was set for 2024. And now, if you add central government fiscal deficit numbers, the national fiscal deficit would breach the 6.5 percentage marks, which is what many of the rating agencies or financial observers have been pointing out about China's local fiscal deficit.
Right. And you passingly alluded to off the book debt, right?
Yes.
Of course, you understand how special purpose bonds perhaps constitute debt, not revenue, and then that takes fiscal deficit for local governments alone to about 4.7%. But how come it has remained off the books? You talked about some obscure accounting practices, right?
Yeah.
And we see these numbers thrown around on a lot of media platforms that China's off the book debt is some 60 or 70 trillion yuan, and that's a lot, right? To have been accumulated in the past many years. So, how does this exactly work, and what makes it off the book, so to say? How do they hide it?
So, everything that I've talked about so far is the balance, is what is on the balance sheet, right? But there is, of course, people must come across news around the fact that the local government debt is piling up and debt to GDP ratio is piling up. And most of the debt, this debt that they talk about, is hidden debt. Now, the Chinese government is aware of that debt. Now, how it came into practice was after the 1994 tax reform that happened. And I mentioned that the revenue share had gone down. And the problem was that the expenditure mandates had been growing. Now, this is also how the political incentive structure works in China, right? One, there are set targets that are given by the central government, and then there are targets that the local governments themselves assume upon themselves because that favors them in the long run and in promotions, etc. Now, to cover for those mandates, you have to raise revenue from other sources. And how land sales revenue started. Now, one important thing that you should know about Chinese local finance is until 2014 or 15, the local governments were not allowed to raise money from the market directly. And now this had a bearing on their finances. They wanted to sell lands to raise revenue, but they could not do it directly. So what they instead did was that they set up local government financial vehicles, also called LGFVs. So they were largely owned by the local government, but the revenue was raised through sale of land rights through LGFVs, and this allowed for them to indirectly raise money from the market. And over the years, there was you saw a huge proliferation of these LGFV models, and they issued bonds, and these bonds were backed by the sale of or the revenue that would come after sale of land rights in future, right? And that's how they were securitized, and future land revenues were kept as collateral. Now, this over the years, this problem was unchecked, and as it went unchecked, the debt kept on piling up. And because these were LGFVs, although owned by the state government but not directly, the figures were not entered in the official books. These debts remained off the books. And according to some independent estimates, these debt, hidden debts, independent assessment put them somewhere between 50 to 100 trillion yuan. Although the party line, the central government's figure that they have put out in the budget and work report is somewhere around 14 trillion yuan, which is quite less than the what the independent assessments, even IMF, has put out, right? So this is one problem that has come up, and this is how the local off budget financing and the LGFVs were a source of off budget financing, and this is how the of hidden debts came into being and practice.
Right. So that's quite a story, right, of mayhem and chaos when it comes to the promises local governments couldn't fulfill. And now it's obviously a huge problem because the state understands that there is a problem vis-a-vis of the book debt, but at the same time, it cannot be accounted for in official and public figures. It cannot be dealt with overnight because it's been piling up for a long time now. And there's no easy strategy to also assure those enterprises or institutions that would have kind of contributed to LGFVs in exchange for the assurance that they will be paid back by what is already a declining revenue, right? So this is quite a vicious cycle. So, Amit, if I can come to you with some final thoughts, and if you could just in these thoughts lay out an understanding of what the Chinese government is doing and what its policy priorities look like to address some of this, and what are the opportunities that challenges that lie in there, that could, I think, be a really useful concluding point to bring this whole story together and kind of give our listeners an idea about what the future trajectory of local government financing in China looks like.
Yeah. So the first time the central government came to realize the threat hidden debt posed to the economy was somewhere around 2013, and they ordered an audit, and ordered some 18 trillion yuan of hidden debt came to the fore. And then they successively allowed what they call this policy of opening the front door while closing the back door. What essentially it did was that the budget law, which prevented them from raising money directly from the market, they removed that barrier, and that is how the entire mechanism of special debt revenue or special purpose bonds came in. And they actually allowed the local governments to raise revenue directly from the market, thinking that this might reduce their reliance on LGFV bonds that they issue off the budget and outside the market, right? Alternately, what they also did was that local governments, these quotas that the central government put a lot. Now, mind you that the local governments are not free to raise any amount through special purpose bond. There's a set quota that is allotted by the central government to each, and then distributed among all the local governments, all the provincial and sub-provincial governments across China. And that is how the quota is decided. And within that quota, every local government has to raise revenue through special purpose bonds. Now, what the government has done, the central government has done, is that they have allowed them to, they have given them two options. Either they can raise new revenue through those special purpose bonds, or they could swap the hidden debt that was outside the balance sheet with that special purpose bonds. So this might mean not raising any new revenue, but just replacing those with hidden debt. So that is how the hidden debt would come into official figures and then accounted for. So this is what they have done. What they also did was a majority of debts, they cracked down on LGFVs. They said no, from 2015 onwards, no new LGFV debt can be added to official government debt. So, and government backing was taken completely back, and all the existing debt were either classified as state debt or commercial debt. And most of the debts were converted into commercial debt without government backing. So this is how they got rid of some of the debt that they had piled up over the years. Now, very interestingly, last year, I think in November, they came out with $10 trillion of debt swap arrangement for the local governments. Now, many thought that this would be a bailout package for them, for the local government, that would bail out about $10 trillion of hidden debt, UN of hidden debt, and take the burden off from the local governments. But essentially, what it was that the 10 trillion UN package was had two components. One was 6 trillion UN, which they would open up for the local governments to swap their again hidden debt, something that is not on the balance sheet, and they would get that again quota, and the local governments would be allowed to swap their hidden debt with official debt, and this would essentially bring down, because now these debt would be backed purely be backed by the government. These would bring down the interest rates and therefore save some 400 billion UN for the Chinese government. That's not a lot given the scale of debt that the local governments owe right now. And the 4 trillion UN component, the second component of the 10 trillion Chinese yuan debt swap package, was to be given again as a quota to the local governments over a period of 5 years. That would essentially come out to about 800 billion Chinese yuan per year, and that this would be added to their special purpose bond uh, quota every year. So, say for example that the last year the Chinese local governments raised about 3.8 trillion Chinese yuan through special purpose bonds. Next year they would have an additional quota of 400 billion. Right, you would add, so that would come somewhere around 4.2 trillion Chinese yuan quota. So this is how they would raise. So this is largely mostly a scam. I would say it's an accounting scam that the Chinese central government has attempted, rather than really addressing, except for I think the 6 trillion Chinese yuan that they have given out. But that's also swapping off the debt, hidden debt to official debt. That largely does not address the problem of the debt. That the debt would remain idly the same that existed before. So that doesn't address the problem. And I think the problem is way too huge for the Chinese state to address. And I think what they're essentially doing is stalling the problem. And they have not even recognized the entire amount of local debt that exists outside the balance sheet. Now, the first point of, in terms of solution, if you ask me, would be acknowledging the debt and then maybe going forward.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Amit. Some really interesting policy measures that the Chinese state has tried to bring into action to address or not address, so to say, some of this. And you're right, it is a scam in that essentially if hidden debt is being swapped by official debt, and some $800 billion are being provided to local governments for a year to do that. It's not that this is new money, it's money that they've already spent, but it's just on the books now. So there isn't really a bailout, which moderates a lot of the expectations or the analysis some commentators had around that 10 trillion UN package. But of course, it also brings into picture the fact that the party state may perhaps have to look at a bailout package sometime in the future, lest this problem become huge, right? And that would have to open up the floodgates to greater consumption, lesser savings, more investments, and of course, eventually the generation of more revenue through tax. So I hope with this conversation, our listeners understand just how important local government financing then becomes in China's context. And I hope it's encouraged some food for thought, which of course listeners are encouraged to talk about on Open Takshashila, which is the Takshashila institution's open platform to reflect, educate, and discuss. You can log on to it and become a member of Open Takshashila on opentakshashila.net. The link is in the bio. Thank you so much to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy.
Thank you, Anushka.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaInst or our website takshashila.org.in.